So good. As you know, my name is John Henry, and I'm chairman of the Committee for the Republic. Welcome tonight. A staggering and climbing national debt, soaring past $30 trillion, fuels the global reach of the American military. A large portion of those trillions have been spent unconstitutionally on wars never declared by Congress. Under the Constitution, appropriation bills are not substitutes for declarations of war. We all know that this out-of-control spending would never be tolerated if American voters were taxed for the full cost. To sustain our empire without tax increases, our federal government has borrowed $7 trillion in the last 2 years alone. Most of this debt was simply printed out of thin air and is found now on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. In other words, these U.S. treasuries were not purchased by foreign or domestic investors. How long could this go on? President Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of Treasury William McAdoo, acknowledged that citizens would revolt against the taxes necessary to fund America's entry into World War I. Our national debt then increased 30-fold in 2 years alone. The pattern was set. It's no accident that the Bank of England was created at the onset of the British Empire, and the Fed was the precondition of the American Empire. Today, the United States spends approximately $1.5 trillion annually for so-called national defense. For 20 years, we spent more than $300 million a day in Afghanistan. Today, we're spending more than that in the Ukraine. Imperial debt is a deadweight on the American economy. Imperial debt is an albatross on future generations. The fault is not in the stars, but in ourselves. American voters have been missing in action in holding their elected representatives accountable for their constitutional responsibility for war. Tonight's speakers, university professors Kitch and Julia Mahoney, reject the conventional wisdom that sees no alternative and offer a workable Chapter 11 style bankruptcy restructuring, which you will hear more about. To succeed, we must restore the Constitution's foreign policy of neutrality, which prevailed for more than a century when budget surpluses were the norm. If we don't shut down the military-industrial complex and our endless wars, the United States will share the fate of every other empire. We're going to start now with Ed. It's all yours, Ed.
Thank you. So I'm familiar with the Empire Salon in my role as the husband of Gail Kitch, and I've attended quite a number of sessions as a trailing spouse. And so I'm familiar with the group and your approach to things. And I'm just delighted that Julia and I have the opportunity to make a brief presentation of our work. I know you can bring to it lots of experience and perception and understanding, and perhaps correct mistakes that we are making. Julia and I started working together after the 2007 to 9 financial crisis. We became convinced that the federal government had lost the ability to manage its budget in a way that matched resources with expenditures. And this would eventually lead to increased borrowing, and at some point, the government would exhaust its capacity to borrow. We have had no idea, and still have no idea when that will happen, but we thought it would be useful to make some effort to try and think ahead about what could then happen. It need not simply be the end of the republic or the end of our society. It could be just a very serious problem that would require careful attention. And we were painfully aware that it's very hard for the U.S. Treasury or any component of the U.S. government to discuss this question because if it was known that it was being discussed by the government, it would probably have a significant impact on the financial markets. But we, located in Charlottesville, Virginia, and merely professors at the law school there, could spend all the time we had available worrying about this question, and it would not be newsworthy. But it's wonderful to be able to interact with a group that's closer to the realities of Washington than we are. Our work is based entirely on the official publications of the Department of Treasury and its own presentation of its financial situation to the world. Now, I sometimes call what Julie and I are doing a project, but this is not a center. There are no foundation grants. There's no staff. It's just us. And both of us teach full loads on other subjects, so we don't do it full time. But we've been pursuing two tracks. One is to make contributions to the academic literature. And we've completed that project, which was published in 2019, onset of the pandemic. And Julia is going to spend her time describing its central thesis. I've provided you with a handout which instructs you how you could get the full text of this article off the internet. You can basically go to our law school website and download a PDF. We think we've made quite a useful long-term contribution to the literature on that question. The second thing we've done is organized and offered almost every year a specialized seminar on the sort of history of the financial structure of the United States government, going back to the controversies over the Bank of the United States at the founding. And we've done this because although we thought there was a problem, and that was partly motivated by the fact that we rather unusually, both of us teach both private law courses and public law courses. In the private law courses, financing and financial markets are an important component of the instruction. But we noticed that our public law colleagues, which is typical of American law school, are quite numerous, although they're very talented and able, have completely ignored this once controversial area of American public law. My diagnosis is that they've ignored it because they've assumed that all the interesting questions had been answered and all the serious problems had been solved. I think my prognosis is that they've not been answered and not been solved, and when there is a crisis, it's going to be necessary for the young generation of lawyers that we're teaching to come forward and again, wrestle with and address those basic questions. Now, one question you could ask, of course, is why in the world do we think are we fairly confident that there are problems in the offering? And one thing I've done in the handout is provided you with the copy of the Treasury Daily Statement, a quite unusual financial report, which has been produced by the U.S. Treasury, as far as we can tell, since early in the 19th century. And it's a cash flow financial statement published on a daily basis of a sort that I am not aware any other financial or government institution in the world produces. And it shows, both on a daily basis and accumulating over the fiscal year, exactly what the government is borrowing, how much debt is paying off, what its expenses are, where the money is going. It seems reliable to me and is produced by, I assume, very talented personnel in the Department of Treasury who've been disciplined and at it for a couple of centuries. I think the ultimate message from the Treasury Daily Statement is that there's trouble. And the most obvious trouble is not the size of the debt. It is the heavy reliance of the government on very short-term borrowing for debt that the government has no plan to pay off. So the practical term of the debt is perpetual, but the funding of the debt is through short-term borrowing. This is a classic balance sheet mismatch, well understood in banking and financial institutions. It was the source of the savings and loan crisis, which the savings and loans lent loan 30-year residential mortgages, and they depended on funding from demand deposits, which made them very vulnerable the minute there was any call on the balance of the demand deposits. And the federal government is doing the same thing, but unfortunately on a much larger scale, and will have a much larger consequence should the structure not remain stable than did the savings and loans. Now, the Treasury Daily Statement causes one to look at the finances of the government from a cash flow perspective, and it, for me, has provided some interesting revelations. One is how important the revenue from the Social Security payroll tax is to the daily liquidity of the federal government, because the tax, which is a first dollar tax imposed on the lower income members of the population, comes in, and its input is what is sometimes called the Social Security lockbox, which means it's basically handed back over to the Treasury, and the Treasury then uses that money to pay payroll, Social Security benefits, maintain the Defense Department, and all the many activities of the federal government. And the Social Security Trust Fund is set holding IOUs. It will be able to continue to honor its obligations as long as the government pays back those IOUs. But the problem will be if the government is unable to do so. There have been some recent perturbations or disturbances in the financial markets which trouble me as possible signs that things are getting close to more serious difficulty. There's a wonderful, I think, a wonderful new book called The Lords of Easy Money, written by Christopher Leonard, which is nominally a book about the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, Tom Nagin, I believe was his name, and his approach to the Open Market Committee. But it is also has a lot of information about Jay Powell, and reports that Jay Powell, prior to his succession to the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve, was, like Nagin, very concerned about the effects of the liberal money creation by the Federal Reserve Board and its impact on the stability of the banking system. He shared those concerns. Nagin actually voted no against some of Bernanke's policies. Powell never did. But once Powell became chairman, he basically, the book says, surrendered to the need to provide funding to the federal government. And so I think there's a strong case that the current operating policy of the Fed is to honor its historic goals of employment and low inflation. But it actually has a third goal, which has a higher priority, which is the Fed takes it as its responsibility to maintain stability in the Treasury market no matter what. Now, of course, Powell has announced but not implemented a so-called tightening policy. It's an open question what will actually happen when that policy is unrolled. Second, it has been very little noted that as part of the federal government response at the onset of the pandemic, which included the creation of a series of special purpose vehicles, subsidiaries of the New York Fed, to provide widespread funding through many markets, including there was one for the ordinary people called the Main Street Fund, that the principal funding was actually for the primary dealers, which are the large financial institutions basically assigned to bid at Treasury auctions. The largest amount of credit at one point was extended to the primary dealers through that special purpose vehicle, which means that the Fed was actually funding the ability of the purchasers of treasuries to buy the treasuries. The Fed is by statute not permitted to purchase directly in treasury auctions. Congress, a long time ago, understood that it would just be too naked a process if the Treasury simply borrowed money and got it from the Fed and the Fed lent it. There's a supposedly independent market, but behind the scenes, the Fed has had to fund it. What the full story of that is, I don't know, but I think it's, again, very troubling. Finally, you may have noticed that the Department of Treasury is paying 9.62% on Series I savings bonds, which is a move that has a lot of serious implications. For one, it's overwhelming the Treasury computer system, as we reported in the papers last week, as people rush to get this, quote, safe but high-yielding investment. The Treasury cannot, as a general matter, offer Treasury interest rates superior to the private financial market without destroying the private financial institutions. So in this case, They say they're trying to prevent that by limiting purchases to 10,000 per person. I can report I made the mistake of buying 11,000, and they told me I was in violation of the rules, but they didn't give me my money back. If this 9% rate were to spread to the rest of the treasury market, the 30 trillion plus outstanding, the interest cost to the United States government would soar to more than half of what is commonly referred to as the annual expenditure, and would throw the whole system into disarray. So with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Julia, who is more expert in constitutional law than I am, and full of wisdom and insight on these issues.
And thank you, John Henry, and to the rest of you. I am very interested in your comments, so I'll try to keep my own remarks fairly short. Less than 3 years ago, as Ed and I were putting the final touches on this article that you have all been sent a link to, the total debt figure of the United States, the total debt of the United States government was approximately $22.7 trillion. That compares to 30 trillion now. So in roughly 2.5 years, so from September 30th, 2019 to today, that is just an extraordinary run-up. Interestingly, the $22.7 trillion national debt of September 30th, 2019 included about $6 trillion of so-called intragovernmental holdings. Those are special treasury securities held by trust funds, most importantly, the Social Security Trust Fund. Of course, the Social Security Trust Fund looks nothing like any private trust fund. You all know that. Now in the year 2022, with a $30.4 trillion debt as of Monday, May 23rd, we have 6.5 trillion in intragovernmental holdings. In other words, the intragovernmental debt hasn't gone up that much. It is debt owed to non-governmental entities that has soared. And wow, has it soared. So what will happen? The conventional wisdom has always been that the treasuries issued by the United States government are sacrosanct, at least the conventional wisdom during my lifetime, the conventional wisdom as judged from what various Washington, D.C. insiders write in various books. U.S. treasuries have a kind of absolute first priority. That debt must be paid. Even the United States Supreme Court has gotten in on this a little bit in its main community health options case in 2020 about the so-called risk corridor payments that Congress had by statute promised to various health insurers. A subsequent Congress had failed to appropriate the money. The health insurers sued and they won in front of the Supreme Court. They had lost some of the suits anyway in front of the lower courts. But the Supreme Court wrote, per Justice Sotomayor, in establishing the temporary risk corridors program, Congress created a rare money mandating obligation requiring the federal government to make payments under a formula set out in law. Congress refused to appropriate the money, as I just mentioned, and it didn't repeal the law either, though. And the Supreme Court says that means they have to pay. But in saying that the federal government would have to pay, the Supreme Court wrote something that I found quite striking because it reflects the conventional wisdom of U.S. history, but I think anyway, it is not accurate. The court says these principles reflect a principle as old as the nation itself. The government should honor its obligations. And the court then cited Alexander Hamilton's report on public credit. The thing is, though, that the United States hasn't always honored its obligations. Judged by how financial historians code defaults, the United States government has defaulted twice on U.S. government debt. The first time it did so was shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, when Alexander Hamilton presided over a debt restructuring. Simply put, the various creditors who had lent money to the national government and to the state governments, that state government debt being, of course, assumed eventually by the national governments in the early years of the Republic, not all those creditors were repaid in full and on time. Oh, some were. Some of the Amsterdam markets, of credit markets, so far as we can tell. But those were holding a lot of domestic creditors and so on. They, in effect, engaged in or participated in an exchange offer. The United States government, in effect, said, we'll pay you something, but you won't get everything. You won't be paid in full and on time. Now, why did this work? This worked because Alexander Hamilton's plan, he wasn't the only one making this plan, of course, but it was successful. In essence, the United States right-sized its debt in the early 1790s. It put the nation on a much sounder financial footing, setting it up for meteoric economic growth. Now, that is a real feat, one that has not often been achieved in history. To be able to restructure one's debt and at the same time put in place a framework that will assure future creditors that one is a good bet, that really was an extraordinary thing for the US government to pull off, but pull it off we did. Now, fast forward though to the Great Depression, to the 1930s. Soon after FDR becomes president, all sorts of nations are going off the gold standard in reaction to devastating world financial crisis. Franklin Roosevelt is a bit cagey when he runs for president in 1932 about whether he will preside over the US going off the gold standard. But very soon after his inauguration in March 1933, the answer is clear. Yes, the United States is going off the gold standard. And part of that is that the United States government abrogates the gold clauses in its debt. In effect, it's not going to pay. It's promised that it will, in effect, pay in gold, but it's not going to. Aggrieved bondholders sue, and what happens? They get to the Supreme Court eventually, and the Supreme Court delivers one of its most cryptic opinions ever. In effect, saying, yeah, there's a problem here, the US government, but there are no damages. If there are no damages, then there's no way to come into court, to be, in effect, in the Court of Claims demanding money from the United States government. About the only thing we can say for sure about this decision from the United States Supreme Court is that the unhappy creditors of the United States government did not get their money. So by mentioning these historic incidents, am I suggesting that it would be a good thing for us to default? Absolutely not. I'm only saying that it's possible that our Constitution, although often billed as being a hard constraint against failure to repay US government debt in full and on time, actually does nothing of the sort. When we look at the document carefully and look at the text and the history and the structure, what do we see? We see that in Article 6, part of the original Constitution, ratified in 1788, we see a statement that says all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. It says nothing about not defaulting on government debt. And very interestingly, in the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, there was discussion about including language in the Constitution that would explicitly preclude defaulting on United States government debt. And guess what? It wasn't put in there. Now, you might say, but what about the Bill of Rights? In 1791, the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution. And those 10 amendments, of course, include the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment includes the Takings Clause. Doesn't that provide for significant protection for property rights? Yes, it does. But there are a lot of questions. Who would be allowed to come into court and sue? Is the Takings Clause self-executing? In particular, there are no definitive answers to any of these questions. It also bears mention that when the Fifth Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791, there's not a shred of evidence that the original public understanding was that the Fifth Amendment was going to preclude the sort of debt restructuring that the nation was in the early 1790s in the thick of. So whatever the Fifth Amendment means, at the time that it was added to the Constitution, it was not understood to be anything that could preclude default. There is, of course, a very famous phrase in the 14th Amendment added to the Constitution in 1868 in the wake of the Civil War, which says that the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. That phrase has been interpreted by some to forbid any kind of US government debt default, but I, and I'm not the only one, have argued that questioning debt is very different from restructuring it. After all, there are lots and lots and lots of sovereign debt restructurings in the world, many by nations who are not questioning that they took on the obligation. They admit they took on the obligation. They are simply saying that given the other requirements, the other demands on government, which of course include delivering a lot of goods and services to the people, including national defense, given those other, and of course maintaining a safety net like our Social Security and Medicare, given those other requirements, they can't pay their creditors, they can't pay their bondholders, and so there has to be some kind of readjustment. Now, again, this is not my first choice, but one reason that I wanted very much to work with Ed and write the article that we've written, and also to continue with some follow-up projects, is that I think that we need to think outside the box. We have to, given the extraordinary level of promises that the US government has made, I think it would be a good idea to think more carefully about exactly what the nature of these promises are, and how it is that if it turns out that, as many are concerned, the United States government cannot easily meet all the obligations it has taken on, the promises of Social Security payments, the promises of pensions to federal government employees, the promises of lifelong health care to those who have been injured in our various military operations abroad, and on and on and on. I think it would make sense not to wait for a crisis, but at least to think a little bit about putting in place institutions that could facilitate financial reorganization. First and foremost, as Ed was just discussing, there is the concern about a rollover shock. Many, many, many nations have been able to easily roll over their debt. And as Ed points out, lots and lots of US debt is short term, have been able to easily roll over their debt until they can't. And sometimes this inability to roll over debt comes with very little warning. So one of our first, goals in the article that we published was to at least set out a few thoughts as to how to reduce the risk of a rollover crisis. Ed has suggested that we seriously consider issuing perpetuals, that is, having debt that won't have to be rolled over because it would be perpetual in duration. The British government had such debt for a long time. We could also issue more long-term debt, and we could also have various kinds of funds that are designed to be in place in the event that there is some sort of rollover shock. In the longer term, I think we could also have in place institutions that would at least contemplate that there might need to be some sort of serious public discussion about restructuring the United States government's obligations. What I think it would make sense to try to avoid is what we've seen in roughly the past generation. It seems to me that our nation has gotten into the habit of not putting in place things to address foreseeable crises, with the result that when crisis comes, there's a great deal of panic, followed by massive expenditures. We saw this in the wake of 9/11 with our invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and other spending on homeland security. We see huge jumps in our debt, and frankly, it does not appear we got our money's worth. We see the same thing after the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. Shock that there's a financial crisis, even though many people had warned that about instability in the financial system, followed by massive spending, which is ad hoc and not terribly well thought through. And of course, we have just come through 2 years of an extraordinary amount of spending, a lot of it as the result of the COVID-19 crisis. Again, it was not unknown that there are such things as pandemics. The memory of the 1918 to 1920 flu pandemic was certainly alive in the minds of bioethicists and others. But again, we did not plan carefully. So I am simply arguing that we have the capacity to plan carefully, and I hope that we'll do so. So anyway, with all that, I look forward to your comments and questions. So thank you.
Good. Who would like to ask the first? Bert, let me get this off of here and give it to you.
Thank you very much for your presentation on a very important topic. I was wondering to what extent you have looked at a solution that's been offered by some on the left called modern monetary theory, which is basically spend without any concern and the problems will go away. But of course, what that would lead to would be an enormous inflation, which they tend not to worry about. But I was wondering to what extent, in the context of the article you've written and your research you've done, if you've looked at modern monetary theory, or MMT, and to what extent have you developed any rebuttals of it?
We are very interested in MMT and have followed the debates over it.
So we've thought a lot about it, and we haven't been able to decide whether it's worth responding to it seriously. I think basically I argue that it seems to have such influence that it needs to be addressed, and it has had such influence that it needs to be addressed. It is popularly understood as basically you can borrow money for free, and why not? The theory, as expressed by its exponents, says you can borrow as long as it doesn't cause inflation, and then you stop borrowing. And their preferred way to stop borrowing is to raise taxes to pay off the debt. That is, it's sort of, we have this amazing credit, we can borrow all this money. Why not pick it up off the street and spend it? It's all free. It seems to me, my view is it ignores a couple of really major problems. The first is it ignores, and the government whole fiscal structure ignores, the extent to which the United States government is an enormous insurance company, which exists to protect the citizenry against sort of unexpected disasters. And we see that natural disasters, we have a Defense Department that is supposed to repel invaders should they show up. Pandemics, the government is supposed to, expected to respond at unknown times in unknown amounts. Now, insurance companies are required to carry reserves, but the government does not establish any reserve at all. Its reserve is basically the capacity to borrow. And if you say, well, we can borrow now and we just borrow all we can, the government will lose the capacity to borrow in an emergency. The second thing is that it ignores the long-standing pattern of these kind of financial crises occurring unexpectedly and very quickly. This is the history with banks and governments and so on. one moment, everybody thinks they're just fine, wonderful, good credit, and so on, and within days, there's a scandal, some information, some event, and all of a sudden, the panic begins. And there's no institution in the world that is going to stand behind the United States government if there's a panic in United States government debt. I mean, nobody is big enough. And so I think the modern monetary theory is sort of plays with the abstractions of macroeconomics, but it just doesn't struggle with the very real reality of funding essential government services through thick and thin.
And just one more thing to add. I think MMT seemed to be all the rage when inflation was low, and now the inflation is here, and so it looks much less attractive. And the inflation is here, and it is also obvious that it's going to be very difficult to raise taxes, which has been the standard answer of Stephanie Kelton and other proponents of MMT to the, well, what if we begin to face some serious inflation? So far as I can figure out, the response has been, well, we can raise taxes that will soak up some of the money, but it's really difficult politically to raise taxes when people are facing this kind of suffering. So.
Good. I see Warren Coates is back here. Oh, we got Paul. Is Paul on? Oh, Warren will be right with you. We're being ecumenical here, and we have our online presence. And Paul Horn is one of the most financially literate members of our board. Paul, you're ensconced somewhere in downtown Paris, right? Go ahead. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you from Paris. You can tell these are 17th century beams above my head here. Very interesting comments, Ed and Julia. I would note that one of the classic ways that politicians have dealt with the deficit and debt is inflation. And obviously, you realize that we have current inflation as a result of supply chain problems, the rise in fuel prices, and more to come. In that context, I think it's important to point out that our non-inflationary potential GDP growth is less than 2% and has been that as a result of demographics and productivity growth slowing. And in that context, my calculations since the Trump tax cuts on is that between the Fed and Congress, we've had approximately 50% of GDP added to potential spending in the economy, and then you could add in excess savings. So this is a huge amount of stimulus being given to an economy which cannot grow without inflation at more than 2%. So from my point of view, inflation has built into the answer of dealing with the debt over the next medium and long term. And this is confirmed by one of our previous Salon speakers, Maya McGinnis, at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget Deficit. And they came out today with a note that's pointing out that the expected inflation rate will, in fact, lower the debt as a percent of GDP to less than 100% of GDP this year and next year, although by 2032, it may get to 110% of GDP. So in effect, what the Committee for Responsible Federal Deficit is saying is that inflation will be much of the answer to dealing with the debt. I would also point out in response to something Julia said, and that is the United States has the lowest total tax burden of any of the major countries. The total tax burden, including Social Security, is about 25.5% of GDP, which puts us in the good company of Mexico, Costa Rica, Chile, and Colombia. All of the other advanced economies are 30% or above. And I would note that over the years since Reagan was president, all presidents and Congress have really endorsed lower taxes. But as we have an aging population and a growing deficit and debt burden, we really do need to raise tax revenues. And this could be done in many different ways. But I would disagree with Julia that this approach of raising tax revenues, which is in fact endorsed by Maya McGinnis and the Committee for Responsible Federal Deficit, raising tax revenues is one of the ways. So it seems to me that we can deal with the deficit without restructuring by depending on inflation, which is certainly built in, and raising taxes. Thank you.
Well, yes, maybe. Well, yes, maybe. But politically, I don't see either political party really spearheading higher taxes. Of course, we might be able to raise taxes, and the traditional response to concerns about our debt is, well, we're going to kind of adjust the dials. A little tax increases here, a few spending reductions there, and so on. Maybe some technological development to bend down the cost curve when it comes to things like health and military, though that in practice, but in practice, it's turned out that that's been really, really tough. Ed and I have looked at a lot of really, really, really thoughtful and just proposals for spending cuts and tax increases, Erskine Bowles, for example, and Wright Bowles Simpson, and so on. There have been many, many of them, and they have one thing in common. They have not been adopted. They have not come close to being adopted. I cannot look at any of these proposals, and I have the greatest admiration for the people who put them together. They are honest, hardworking, smart, all kinds of great adjectives. They come up with these wonderful programs, and they don't get passed. There is something about our political environment right now, certainly for the last 15 years, where these proposals that people like the people in this room will think, well, that's okay, kind of reasonable. We could probably live with that. Maybe we should enact some version of that. The fact that we all think this, or many of us think things along those lines, that's not going to make Congress stampede and pass them, so they haven't. So part of it is having had a front row seat at this for after about 15 years, 10 years of watching that, Ed and I began to think, well, maybe we should think of other possibilities, and we will see. As for the information that came out today, the Congressional Budget Office did indeed release the numbers that you were just talking about. They're fairly optimistic numbers. Are they right? I hope they're right, that we're going to go, that the debt is going to go down to a little bit under 100% of GDP, and then it's going to rise, at least so the prediction is, but that is if things go pretty smoothly. Notice that there's nothing built into that calculation that contemplates another crisis. If we face another crisis, things will look a lot less rosy. And frankly, the CBO's projections don't look all that rosy, even if everything is smooth sailing from here on in.
So, Ed, go ahead.
So just another element relevant to your comments, which are, of course, germane in terms of inflation. The short term of the debt means that the Treasury constantly has to go back in the market. Inflation will push interest rates up. The Fed can't stop it, and that will increase very significantly interest expense and drive the debt back up.
So let me just understand, are you and Julia saying that any political party that says they're going to run on a tax increase or is not going to win the next election? Is that what you're saying?
I make no political predictions.
Me neither,
But,
no, I make no predictions either. On the other hand, I mean, neither major political party is going to come to me to ask what they should run on, but my guess is if I said to them, I think you should run on higher taxes, that would probably not go over.
right. So Warren Coates is here, who is our March speaker, and kicked off our first reserve currency salon. Warren, you're going to relate this back to that.
I laud your undertaking to do advanced thinking of what the options might be and to be prepared for it. Very, very wise to do that. Several comments. One on modern monetary theory. I have written an extensive analysis of it, and I'm happy that Cato published, and I'll send it to John Henry if anyone would like a copy of that. And you're quite right not to take it seriously. It's just not a serious proposition. I would remind everybody that the 100+% of GDP gross debt, the 30 trillion, is far below the total debt when you take into account the unfunded obligations, the largest of which is probably Social Security, that it is committed by obligation to pay out a certain amount, and as our population gets older, et cetera, that grows, while the working population shrinks proportionally, and that's the source of funds. So the mismatch between money coming in, it's not a trust fund in the sense of built up, it's a cash flow thing. So there's a very, very large unfunded part of the obligations that need to really be added on to the true debt obligation. Finally, I would urge you to look carefully at the Paris Club debt restructurings as models, as examples of what worked well and what didn't. They've kind of established basic rules of the game. And I'm not on top of this anymore, but work is ongoing and I think is about to come to fruition of establishing international standards for sovereign debt restructuring that would guide future episodes. You should surely take that into account for what might be applicable to the United States.
You want to respond? Do either one of you want to respond?
So as to the Social Security, absolutely. And that was one of the things that got me thinking very hard about this, was realizing that Social Security is generally not counted as a financial asset, but you're right. If it were, it would be the largest asset of many American households. And so when push comes to shove, will the electorate support paying off the treasuries, especially treasuries held by foreign owners, rather than having the Social Security checks go out? Color me skeptical. That was what made me, that was the first thing that made me focus on some of these questions. In terms of standards for international sovereign debt restructurings, yes, there's a lot out there and it's fascinating. One of our friends and colleagues, Mitu Galati, is a leader in that. There's always the question about how applicable those practices will be to the United States, because this would be a sovereign debt restructuring of a size unprecedented, and the institutions that ordinarily preside over, after a fashion, those debt restructurings, I don't know if they could handle us, but it's certainly something that's another thing that I want us to begin thinking about. Ed?
Bruce Fahn, our Vice Chairman.
I wanted to ask, what do you think about a bankruptcy model under Chapter 11 reorganization? There are similar claims about repudiating debt early on with regard to private bankruptcies. Ogden and Sanders, you buying into the possibility that a bankruptcy law will impair your contract and you won't get paid in full. And it seems to me there have been municipal restructurings. Puerto Rico, it's not right at the level of the size of the American debt, but those are public restructurings, and you had special boards come in. What do you think about those models of having something like a Chapter 11 declared for the United States, and whether Congress could pass a bankruptcy code amendment and enable the United States to opt for Chapter 11?
Well, we've taught our students about Puerto Rico. It's a very large restructuring operation. It was very difficult. and faced a lot of legal challenges, all done under a special congressional statute. And remember, Puerto Rico is basically a component of the United States government, and it's largely escaped discussion and notice in the United States press and culture. There's been a lot of hardship for the citizens, the American citizens of Puerto Rico. But you could say it was a trial run, and Congress could do something like that for the whole federal government.
Molly, did you want to say? Molly McCartney?
I have a very naive question. When you talk about the debt restructuring as something to think about or execute, who would do that? Would that be the Fed? Would it be Congress? Would it be the executive branch? Who has the authority to do that kind of restructuring? And what kind of opposition would they get from other branches of government?
Is that a
No.
law school exam
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, not naive at all, right? I mean, we think that generally speaking, Congress has the power of the purse, although as John Henry noted, that has been, that we might say that system is not entirely honored in practice. That's something else to discuss, but we'd certainly think that Congress could take the lead. There would be questions, of course, of whether there would be suits against the United States, as there was when the gold clauses in the debt were abrogated in 1933, and who would have standing to sue, and whether, again, I mentioned the issue of the takings clause being self-executing, perhaps, or maybe it would be possible for Congress to provide that some creditors couldn't sue. This could all be worked out. These would be a lot of tussles. It would be extremely messy. That's why I keep admitting this is not my first choice. But it's not impossible. And it is something that, particularly when we think about how much of our debt is held by foreign owners and so on, there might be some kind of discrimination between foreign holders of debt and domestic holders of debt. This could all, and of course courts could be involved up to a point. It is very difficult to imagine any court ordering ordering judgments of such magnitude that in essence the power of the purse would pass to the courts. That would be I think, significant tension with our constitutional structure. So as a preliminary matter, Congress would be taking the lead, but Congress would not be the only actor.
Paul Horn Pat will be ready. Paul Horn wanted to respond. I think Paul will put you back on, show that we're ecumenical with our online participants. Can we replace Paul with the founders with Paul?
In response to what Julia just said about foreign creditors, I would point out that China and Japan are the biggest single buyers of treasuries, and we owe them a lot of money. And in fact, with the Fed raising interest rates and the yield on treasuries rising, they will continue to be among the principal funders of our deficit and debt. And the reason for that is the inadequate U.S. savings. We do not save enough either at a household level, foreign level, or even corporate level. And so we require foreign funding of our balance of payments. And this has been a long time situation since the early 1980s. So part of the restructuring that they're proposing would mean, in effect, and Julia suggested that, in fact, we would favor Social Security payments over repaying foreign creditors. We have to have the source of funding, and that source of funding, because of our low savings rate, has been foreign, and notably Japan and then China, and together, both of them today are major buyers. So I wonder if Julia and Ed could address the problem of inadequate U.S. savings vis-a-vis the deficit and debt.
Yes, it is a problem, no question about it. We have borrowed, what, a trillion, 1.23 trillion from Japan, 1 trillion from China. You're right, they're major holders of our debt. And it would, right, I'm not making any sweeping statements about the feasibility of any of these possibilities. But I am trying to put them on the table and asking us to think them through. As for our domestic purchasers of debt, for example, quite possibly we could have a lot depends on the demographics of the next 10 to 20 years. We certainly have been a nation that takes in a lot of people and makes them citizens. And we've had many great waves of immigration throughout the United States history. We may have more and so forth, so I wouldn't count that out either. But again, I'm not making any proposals and stating that anything could definitely work, but I am suggesting that we begin to think outside the constraints of the usual inside the Beltway discussion about this, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the standard prescriptions are not being taken up by the electorate. For whatever reason, the things that the great and the good of the United States, the things that the great and the good who gather at Davos think are sensible, they're not getting enacted. And that is why I think that we should be thinking more.
Pat Malloy.
I want to thank you both for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, but I had the good fortune of working for the Senate Banking Committee for many years. So I have 4 interrelated questions that all fit together. Paul raised the issue of how much of our debt is owned by foreign governments. What percentage? 2, when you have, will that not mean when interest rates go up, it will increase our current account deficit? 3, if GDP was growing faster, would this be less of a problem for us, the debt problem? 4, do negative net exports, trade deficits, detract from GDP growth? And the fact that we ran $1 trillion worth of manufacturing deficits last year, does that not feed this problem that the country is now facing? Those are 4 interrelated questions, but I think they're very important ones.
Well, I agree with you. So, I think the foreign debt is around 7 trillion of the 30 trillion.
7 trillion up to 30 trillion, that's almost like over 20%.
Yes.
About half held by central banks, roughly. I don't have
Much of it held by Chinese and Japanese, I think, isn't it?
About 2.2 trillion. The Japanese and the Chinese have not in recent years expanded their positions. They've been static. They have not gone up with the amount of debt. So the foreign holding has actually fallen as a percentage. But we can't sustain the trade deficit indefinitely, just like we can't keep it expanding the debt. And so the exchange rates will have to change, and that will be pretty painful for citizens of the United States to pay more. It goes on and on. Everything is connected to everything else.
But one last thing, the fact is that all this money now coming in to buy our treasury because the interest rate is going up, increase the value of the dollar and will add to our trade deficit. Isn't that correct?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yes. Thank you.
We've got online, oh, okay, Warren, you pick up.
I do want to flag that how debt is restructured cannot differentiate between domestic and foreign holders. We are a country that believes in the rule of law. The regulations that would govern it would be the covenant of the bond itself. Whoever holds it, if for a second the world thought that we were going to treat foreigners different than domestic ones, we would be in big trouble.
I like the rule of law. I think it's important that we are a place that is safe to invest. I am frankly horrified when I read casual suggestions that we should seize the property of unpopular foreigners here in the US. I think that's bad, and I think that it is long-term. But I am only looking at history, but when I say there might be a differentiation between foreign holders and domestic holders, I'm looking at current events and at history. And when we sometimes see that, and in a democracy, I think we have to be prepared for there to be a certain level of enthusiasm for that. That would not be a good place to be. I'm not sugarcoating any of this. I'm simply saying that we need to think. I suggest we think about it. That's all.
A question with regard to some of the obligations that the federal government has taken on, and Social Security, of course, is a major one. To what extent have you looked at proposals to basically at least partially privatize the Social Security obligation, not necessarily overnight, but for instance, allowing younger people to basically reduce the amount of Social Security contribution they make in return for having to put money aside in some type of privately funded retirement program, such that over a period of time, and this, we're talking decades, not years, the federal government's pension liability, if you will, would shrink over time. And I'm wondering if there are possibly other federal insurance programs, and flood insurance was one of my favorites, where there can be a phase out of public insurance and substituted with private insurance that would be better priced.
Go ahead. Thank you. Carl Galvin. Might Congress just reclaim its constitutional authority to coin and regulate the value of money, and the Fed begin issuing U.S. notes into the economy? Essentially the greenback solution. But if I could go back to Andrew Jackson, if you, as a research material, his farewell address, he just writes passionately, eloquently, that there is no constitutional basis for a central bank. And the consequences are exactly what we have today. But even harkening back to another document earlier, somewhere in that picture is Roger Sherman. And in 1752, he wrote a paper titled A Caveat Against Injustice, or an inquiry into the evils of a fluctuating medium of exchange. And he'd each colony had its own paper currency, and he got screwed on a business deal where he was repaid in Rhode Island money, which was being inflated rapidly, instead of Connecticut money, which he expected. So he's the one that put the words in the Constitution, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Of course, then money was a very positive, tangible, real thing, as opposed to debt. Money has now become debt, and it seems a tool of enslavement more than anything else. I had a last thought, but I've lost it for the moment. Just a comment on those circumstances.
Well, we try to cover those events in our seminar.
Hold the microphone. We do cover this in the seminar.
We try to communicate to the students that these are very old and very difficult topics to which there's never been a perfect equilibrium solution. And we're not in equilibrium anymore in my views, and we're going to have to do it again.
Okay, let's let Paul ask a question, then we'll come back to Paul. Good.
I'm on. My name is Paul Gallagher. I'm the economics co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review magazine. I have really one big question. Why are you talking about, with respect, why are you talking about a debt reorganization for the United States. There are so many countries in the world, going back to at least in the most recent post-Bretton Woods period, going back to the 1982 debt bomb of the developing countries, so many countries that have needed systematic Hamiltonian reorganization of their debts. The United States is not one of them. So what any country which executes such a reorganization is going to have a more limited capacity to issue credit in the subsequent period. And the question for the United States now, which is most urgent, is not that it reorganize its debt, but that it reorganize its war policy, its attempt to dominate and rule the world through NATO, and bringing us to the verge of nuclear war, and instead issue credit for development of the underdeveloped countries in the world, and issue that credit in cooperation with the other major powers. The United States has more ability to issue such development credit for infrastructure in the developing world than any other country in the world. Why do you want to, why discuss constricting that power? That's the question, is how we should use that national credit capability, which is unequaled in the world, for international development, and stop this policy of the last 30 years of constant wars of choice, and now trying to push to the point of a nuclear war.
Well, I will admit that our horizon is constrained. We're thinking that the United States is not going to have any choice but to deal with these issues for its own credit. As you point out, that's like many other nations. This is an endemic political, governmental, structural problem. We've had a good run, but we're abusing it.
Let me, okay, you want to, is it quick?
To repeat, I lied your project of thinking through these things. But in the spirit of Burton and Paul, first priority ought to be to find ways of reducing or eliminating the continued growth in it. It's wise to do what you're doing, and that's a project, and you should continue with it. But the rest of us, need to think about how to rein in the government's revenue expenditure mix. And let me give one example, because Bert mentioned Social Security, which is a big part of the unfunded obligations going forward. The fix there is relatively simple, and I don't think the public would overly resist it. And it is, by and large, to extend the retirement age. We are all living longer. When Social Security was introduced, people lived, I think, 2 years on average beyond retirement. Now they live 20 to 30 years. Okay, so that's ridiculous. And most people don't want to stop working then anyway. They're happy to go on working. So just, extending the retirement age at which you become eligible for Social Security would save an enormous amount, and I think the public would embrace it. But there are so many other places where we need to look for things like that before we get to the catastrophe that you're rightly preparing for.
Yes, well, I don't think any kind of catastrophe or hard landing is inevitable. In fact, one hope is that by pointing out that if we continue on as we are, there is a significant chance, not a certainty, but a significant chance that, like other nations who've gotten overextended, we will end up with a lot of rough weather. One hope is that that will make people think more seriously about exactly how to maybe do something about Social Security, how to be, from my perspective anyway, more realistic about what we can accomplish on the world stage and so forth, to take a careful, I have an enormous list. I could speak for 3 hours about all the ways in which I would like to, don't worry, I won't, all the ways in which I would like to direct attention to whether or not our weapon systems are right, or is this the result more of crony capitalism and lobbying, or are these actually effective weapon systems and so on? I think we need to think about that too. But we can't do everything. And our areas of expertise, in particular my area of expertise, is the Constitution and its monetary and fiscal qualities. And it has seemed to me that there are things to be said that are important and are not, at least right now, in the general discussion. So that's the goal of this project. But in no way, shape, or form are we rejecting any of the many sensible proposals that many thoughtful people are making. These are great. This is exactly the kind of thing that I want to see more of.
Right. Tom Whitmore is back here. Tom was in the Tea Party, and the Tea Party, I think, addressed the debt issue.
You hear a lot of prescriptions for how to contain the debt, how to roll back inflation, and it seems to me that probably the simplest and the most basic, although there's not much appetite for it in the Congress, is just simply reduce spending. If you're to reduce spending, and indeed, give back the $2 or $2.5 trillion of stimulus money that is out there right now, for COVID, which was the excuse for it. If you were to give that back to the Treasury, you'd get a big, jump start on reducing your inflation. If inflation is reduced, then you can increase GDP. If GDP increases, you get more revenue to the federal government. You reduce the debt. So the simple question is, how do we get the Congress to become responsible? You pass $1 trillion, bill for, infrastructure, and $100 billion goes to infrastructure, and $900 billion goes to favorite charities around the world. That's the easiest way to do it. It's the only way you're going to do it. Everything else, you're going to default on the debt. You're going to make things bad for America. You're going to, cheat, your Social Security recipient. If you pay, paid 7% a year every year for 50 years into a private fund, I guarantee you would retire in a lot better shape than you do on Social Security. So that's my prescription.
Ralph Winnie with the Eurasia Center. Following on your point about overextension, if that happens in the US, do we move to, say, cryptocurrency? Do we do what the Belgians did and they just canceled the Congolese franc to prevent a bankruptcy when the Belgians left the Congo? I mean, what do you foresee happening?
It's going to be very dicey. I don't have any foresight. One of the things we're trying to do is talk seriously about the consequences of the federal government's current course by trying to think about future consequences. And maybe that'll sharpen people's attention.
Okay. Yeah, Bruce?
I wanted to address Warren's idea that we would never discriminate against foreigners. Recently, President Biden signed a bill that entrusted him with discretion to identify all Russian oligarchs that he thinks have more than $5 million, take the money from them and give it to Ukraine. That's, I would say, discrimination against foreigners, a violation of many provisions of the Constitution as well. But I think you underestimate the willingness of the United States Congress for political purposes to engage in the most invidious discrimination, debt restructuring or otherwise.
And we'll pay a price for that.
Yes.
Good. You've got a question? Let me get him first. He's been, I'll get him.
Thank you very much. I'm Jerry Belsky. I represent the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. And we have an idea. You talked about out of the box. And I'd say there is an idea that's being discussed now around the world, out of the box, which directly relates to Alexander Hamilton. Yes, which is restructure the entire global financial system. It's bankrupt. It's not simply the US debt, that's minor compared to the 2 quadrillion of derivative debt, which is not on any book, but we've been bailing out for the last, 8 years or 9 years. It's bankrupt. The system itself is bankrupt. Now, you pointed to how Hamilton reorganized the system very productively in the United States, and the way he did it was he didn't simply rearrange the debt. He tied the debt to credit, as Paul was talking about, from the national bank. And he gave people shares in a national bank to pay off the debt, but he invested the debt in infrastructure, in manufacturing. In other words, it's not just money, it's a question of the productive powers of labor. Now, there's a discussion going on right now about a new economic system. And I would say it's this discussion that's motivating some people to want to go to the brink of nuclear war, because Russia and China are discussing ideas which are very similar to Alexander Hamilton. Therefore, they are not the enemy. The enemy are those people who want to destroy any possibility of a new economic system. So the Schiller Institute is proposing a new financial and security architecture in which the United States and other countries would sit down at a conference, restructure the world economy. In fact, if you started with one particular law called Restoring Glass-Steagall on a global scale, you would instantly wipe out most of the obligations of bailing out the derivative, because if the banks are only, or the U.S. is only responsible for the debt of banks, which are legitimate deposits and not gambling debts, you've just eliminated the speculative bubble. But you have to implement credit for real development. And what Paul was talking about is, if you look at all these developing nations, there's an enormous need. Look at the food supply, look at the fertilizer. I mean, just look at, baby formula. If you put credit into building factories and infrastructure and new technology like fusion, you will actually put people back to work that can easily repay. As Hamilton said, a little bit of debt is a blessing if you provide the means to repay it. So if you issue the debt as credit. So anyway, that's my proposal, that we sit down with nations. And in fact, the Schiller Institute is going to have a conference on the 18th and 19th. We're inviting the Chinese, the Russians, India, other countries to sit down, and let's get people in the US to sit down, because we all have the same problem. It's not an internal US problem. The global financial system is bankrupt, and the US dollar is either going to be restructured or it's going to be destroyed, and we don't want to see it destroyed.
Skip Kaltenhauser. My understanding is that MMT really depends heavily upon the spending priorities. Bridges, education, healthcare, say, as opposed to forever wars. The other part of my question is, how exposed are we to Wall Street derivatives, dark pool trading, and is there any chance of returning Glass-Steagall to get us out of this predicament?
Well, my view has been, from what I've read, is that Glass-Steagall didn't really address anything and wasn't a solution. So I wouldn't expect a similar regulatory structure to be helpful. But I could learn more from your view, and I'm glad to hear about the project of your institute. As we say, there's a lot of need for thinking outside the box.
Well, Ed, Julia, I want to thank you so much for being so provocative and raising these questions. I don't think you hear this discussion very many places, and your paper is terrific in terms of kicking this discussion off. So we want to thank you very much.